Going to start our recording, and I would like to welcome Heather Brugel in honor of Women's History Month. We are pleased to have Heather join us, and who will be speaking on the power of Native women. Heather is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and a first-line descendant of the Stockbridge-Munsee. She is the former Director of Education and led the fellowship program for Forge Project, which is a Native-led initiative in Taconic. Heather is a historian, activist, and deep colonial education consultant who works with institutions and organizations for Indigenous sovereignty and collective liberation. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much for having me. I think I did one of these talks last year, so it's really good to be back and do it again this year. I am very excited to talk about some Indigenous women throughout history because it is Women's History Month. And so it's really good to bring the Indigenous perspective to this. So the way this talk is broken down is I have picked a number of Indigenous women who were really awesome or who did really awesome things throughout history. And we're going to talk a little bit about them. I'm going to tell you about them. It's really cool. I'll share some resources with you at the end. And then if you have any questions, I will make sure I leave plenty of time for Q&A. I do tend to get a little rambly. Sometimes when I'm talking, I think just as a historian, that's kind of what happens. So I really hope that you enjoy this tonight. You learned something maybe you didn't know before. You get excited to go and learn about somebody new. So I'm really excited about this. So I really hope that you guys are excited about it as well. So this is the power of Native women. Yeah, let me just make my slide go. There we go. Heidi did a land acknowledgement earlier, which I thought was so great. So thank you so much for doing that. Mine's very similar to what Heidi said. I make sure it's very important to honor the land that we're on. We acknowledge that we're coming from all different locations that were the ancestral homes of Indigenous nations. In upstate New York, where I'm at, we acknowledge the Mahikaniak, people of the waters that are never still. We acknowledge that through forced land cessions and removal, this nation was removed from the land that they called home, and their seat of government is now located in Wisconsin, and they're known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, and we understand that this acknowledgement is just a first step in the process of building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. So very important to make that acknowledgement. My name is Heather. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, first-line descendant, Stockbridge-Munsee. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm an independent Indigenous consultant. I love history. I love decolonial education. I love doing land acknowledgements and all sorts of fun things. My email is up there, hbrigel2014@gmail.com. You can reach me there. I have a Twitter. I use it occasionally. I use my Instagram more. So if you want to follow me on Instagram, see cute pictures of my dogs, you can follow me at Heather M. Brigel. And you can also visit my website, heatherbrigel.com. Just launched earlier this week. So yay. So very excited about that. So that's just a little bit about me. I will put my email on my website in the chat towards the end. So if you miss it, you'll have it then again later. So I am going to talk a little bit about Indigenous women, but before I do that, I want to tell you that women have always played an important role in Native communities. Many times women were in charge of gathering materials and then building the homes for everyone in those communities. They were the center of the community, center of the home, the heart of the nation, and the source of life. They would often accompany their husbands on buffalo hunts, and after the buffalo was killed, they would help, with getting the hide, using the bones, every part of the animal was used. In Eastern tribes, women were the originators of the longhouse system of government, in which they decided which men were going to lead it. And just so you're aware, if you're ever on Jeopardy, the US form of government is actually modeled after the longhouse form of government. So just so you know, US government is modeled after Indigenous government. In Cherokee culture, women had freedom to own their own homes, freely divorce, and they were considered equals. Fathers were not thought of as actually being related to the children because the women did the child rearing. They ruled the homes and they had control over how their children were raised. Council meetings were open to women, an idea that colonists couldn't understand, and we'll talk more about that later on. In Haudenosaunee society, women were keepers. They were responsible for defining political, social, and economic norms for the tribe. Lineage was traced through the mother, not the father. Women owned the lands and planted the crops. The Women's Council had the ability to remove anyone from their council if you expressed an opinion that clashed with the Women's Council. They had the power, and that is predominantly in Eastern tribes as well. So that's just a brief overview of how Indigenous women were looked at in the community. So I think I picked about 14 women, so not a lot, but enough, that we're going to talk about today. And the first one I want to talk about is Pocahontas. So each of these women were picked for a particular reason. Either their stories were not told correctly, or they just did really awesome things, and I wanted to like clear the air and bring things to the forefront. So I picked Pocahontas because I feel like she is oftentimes misunderstood. So she was born near present-day Jamestown, Virginia. She's the daughter of Chief Powhatan, who was the ruler of the Powhatan Confederacy. When the colonists first came to Jamestown in May of 1607, it was later that year that John Smith was captured by a hunting party that was led by Powhatan's brother. In 1608, when Smith recounts the incident, he never once mentioned Pocahontas. In 1616, Smith writes to Queen Anne before Pocahontas is to arrive in England, and this is where the story of Pocahontas and John Smith gets embellished, right? That whole mythologized romance and saving his life and all of that, that's where he mentions this. In 1613, Pocahontas was captured by the English, tricking her into boarding a boat. She was held there for a year, and not a lot is actually known about what happened to her when she was on that ship. There were reports made through oral tradition that she was a victim of repeated sexual assaults, and this has been disputed, but it comes up numerous times in oral traditions. It was also during her time there that she was taught English and she learned about Christianity. And it's believed that at this time she converted, she was baptized, and the name given to her was Rebecca. Before all of this, oral tradition also indicates that Pocahontas was married before her capture and that she had a daughter. That he was killed after she was captured and that their daughter was raised by the village. So while she's being held in captivity, she meets John Rolfe. And in April of 1614, the two were married and lived in Virginia for 2 years. They had a son named Thomas who was born in 1615. The marriage helped create a peace between the tribes and the English that became known as the Peace of Pocahontas, and it lasted for about 8 years. That's a really long time. It was decided that since there was this great peace, you had to bring Pocahontas to England now to show how the English tamed the savage and the success of the Virginia colony. They arrived on June 12th, 1616. She was paraded around as an Indian princess when in reality she was not. She was put on display for all of the world to see. Her and Rolfe lived in England for a time, and then in 1617, they boarded a ship to head back to Virginia. It didn't make it past the River Thames when she became very ill. She was taken back to shore, where she died soon after that at only the age of 21. She's buried at the cemetery at St. George's, but it isn't clear where her grave actually is because when the church burnt down, the records were burnt and her grave was not marked. She is a complicated yet wonderfully misunderstood person, and history does not do her justice. So that's why I wanted to talk a little bit about her today. The next person I'd like to talk about is Nancy Ward. She was Cherokee, and she was born in what is present-day Tennessee. When she was growing up, the Cherokee were facing invasions from Christian missionaries. Her uncle eventually allowed the missionaries to come to Cherokee territory as long as they built a school to teach the Cherokee youth English. When she was in her teens, she married a Cherokee man by the name of Kingfisher. By the time she was 17, she had 2 children. She fought alongside her husband in the Battle of Taloa against the Creeks, and when he was killed, she picked up his rifle and led the Cherokee to victory. It was after this battle that she received the name Beloved Woman, and she was the only woman to be a voting member on the Cherokee General Council, and she also became the leader of the Cherokee Women's Council. In the late 1750s, Nancy married an Englishman by the name of Bryant Ward, and they had a daughter. He would eventually move back to South Carolina to live with his first wife, who was of European descent. After the American Revolution, though, Nancy became a de facto ambassador between the Cherokee and the white settlers. She, along with a group of Cherokee, met an American delegation to discuss settlements along the Little Pigeon River. She expressed surprise that there weren't any American women at the negotiations. And the Americans expressed their horror that there were Cherokee women at the negotiations. To counter this, Nancy said, quote, "You know that women are always looked upon as nothing, but we are your mothers. You are our sons. Our cry is all for peace. Let it continue. This peace must last forever. Let your women's sons be ours, our sons be yours. Let your women hear our words." She died in 1822 in Tennessee at the inn that she owned, and she was buried on top of a hill that overlooked that inn. This was the last remaining land that her people had before they were forced upon the Trail of Tears. We have Sacagawea, who was born in 1787 and grew up surrounded by the Rocky Mountains and the Salmon River region in what is present-day Idaho. In 1800, during a buffalo hunt, she was kidnapped by the Hidatsa tribe, who were enemies of the Shoshone. Her captors brought her back with them to present-day Bismarck, North Dakota. In 1803 or 1804, for whatever reason, she became the property of Toussaint Charbonneau, who was at least 20 years older than her. She became one of his two wives and became pregnant very quickly. In 1803, the U.S. had just acquired the Louisiana Purchase. After a year of planning and travel, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark reached the Hidatsa settlement. Sacagawea was 6 months pregnant at this time. They immediately recognized the value in Charbonneau, and they recognized the value in Sacagawea in her language skills. She could speak not only Shoshone, but also Hidatsa. On February 11th, 1805, she gave birth to her son, and on April 7th, they headed out with Lewis and Clark. There was an incident that happened on this journey that gave her instant respect. The boat that she was sailing in hit a squall and it capsized. Charbonneau panicked, but it was Sacagawea that had the calmness to gather important papers, navigational tools, medicines, and other things that would have been lost. She identified roots and plants and berries and what they could be used for. She navigated the mountains using her knowledge of the Shoshone trails. She led the way. After reaching the Pacific, she and her husband and others returned back to the Hidatsa settlements. For his service, Charbonneau received 323 acres of land and $500.33. I don't know what the 33 cents was for, but that was part of it. Sacagawea received nothing. In 1809, she and her family traveled to St. Louis to meet up with William Clark and to take up farming, but that didn't work out. In August of 1812, she gave birth to a daughter, and shortly after, her health began to decline. She died December 22nd, 1812, and it is believed that she's buried in Wyoming on the Wind River Reservation. Sarah Winnemucca was the daughter of a chief of the Northern Paiute near what is present-day Nevada. In the 1850s, she spent time in California and lived with the family of Hiram Scott. It was here that she learned the ways of the white world and that she mastered English. She became an interpreter for the U.S. Army, and later she became a school teacher at a reservation school in Oregon. In 1872, her tribe was forced to relocate to Eastern Oregon. In 1878, when the Vietnam Wars broke out, she served as an Army scout and a messenger and secretly led her father's band of Paiute to safety from an enemy camp. After the war, many Paiute who left the area were forced onto the Yakima Reservation in Oregon. Many died from disease and starvation, and because there were so many bodies, they were just thrown into the Columbia River. And all they wanted to do was return to their homelands back in Nevada. So in 1879, Sarah actually starts out on a lecture tour where she spoke on the plight of her people. She traveled to Washington, D.C. to try to get help for her people back home and get them back to Nevada. At first, she received a promise that they would get their land back, but in the end, it never happened. She then helped her people to organize a passive resistance to being denied their home. She instructed them to do nothing. Don't farm, don't build houses, do nothing. And eventually, a small band was able to escape back to their homelands. She wrote and published a book, Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims. She worked tirelessly to make sure her people were able to live on their promised land. However, in the end, the promises were broken, and in 1883, she traveled and spoke over 300 times on behalf of her people. She died of tuberculosis in 1891 in Idaho, never have making it back to her homelands. Now, Buffalo Calf Road Woman is one of my favorites. All of these women are my favorites, but she's definitely one of them. She was a young Cheyenne warrior who was instrumental at the Battle of the Rosebud, and it was during this battle that she was able to save her brother from death. But where she really shined was during the Battle of Little Bighorn, and she fought alongside her husband, Black Coyote. It was said that she was the one who struck the blow that knocked Custer off of his horse that would eventually lead to his death. This was confirmed in 2005 when the Northern Cheyenne broke their silence about the battle and publicly recounted the battle from their oral history, and she shows up in that history. She was pretty darn cool. After surrendering to the U.S. Army, her and her husband and children were moved to the Southern Cheyenne Reservation in what is present-day Oklahoma. She and her family were part of the Northern Cheyenne Exodus, which was a breakout from the Oklahoma Reservation back to their homelands in Montana. Along the journey, she and her husband ended up killing not she and her husband, but her husband ended up killing a military officer and was eventually found and arrested and was awaiting trial. While he was in prison, she got sick and died of diphtheria in May of 1879. When Black Coyote heard of her death, he then took his own life in prison. She didn't get to live to see her people finally being able to settle on their homelands in Montana. Susan Lafish. She was born on the Omaha Reservation in Nebraska and was the daughter of the tribe's chief Joseph Lafish, also called Iron Eyes. When she was younger, she witnessed the death of a Native woman because a white doctor refused to treat her. Because of that incident, this changed the course of Susan's life. She went on to become the first female Native American doctor. She graduated from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1889, and she got many great, very lucrative opportunities, but instead she turned them all down and she returned to her reservation. She traveled around and provided care for all of those living on the reservation and addressed many health issues of those who were still living there. She promoted modern sanitary standards, such as washing your hands and other things that we do today. And she also advocated for the temperance of her people. She often pointed out that alcoholism brought misery to many of her people. And she knew this personally because her husband suffered with alcohol. Before her death, she saw her dream come true, and a hospital opened on the reservation, and it was opened to all people. She died of bone cancer on September 18, 1915, and was buried in Bancroft, Nebraska. Elizaburton Conley was a member of the Wyandot Nation in Kansas. From a young age, she and her sisters, her other siblings, were encouraged to get an education. So she did just that. And in 1902, she graduated from the Kansas City School of Law and became the first woman admitted to the Kansas bar and the first to argue a case before the Supreme Court. She didn't win her case, but she got to argue in front of the Supreme Court, first Indigenous woman to do so. In 1855, the U.S. government deemed the Wyandot fit to be become citizens. Because yes, in 1855, Indigenous people were not citizens of the United States. Indigenous people didn't become citizens of the United States till 1924. But prior to that, there were certain ways that you could become a citizen of the United States. One being if you were a woman and you married a non-native person, maybe there was some military service, or if the government actually deemed you worthy of becoming a US citizen. This is all very tricky. So yes, in 1855, the Wyandot were deemed fit to become citizens. So their land was divided among the members, but there was also some tribal structure that remained in place, and they retained legal authority over a cemetery that was theirs. In 1906, the Wyandot of Oklahoma, different tribe, approved the sale of that cemetery for development. Eliza and her sisters strongly disagreed with the sale of this cemetery. They ended up making like a little shack right outside the cemetery, and they took shifts sleeping and staying there so they could protect it around the clock. She took up the cause of protecting Native American cemeteries and worked tirelessly to have them protected under federal law as well. In 1907, she filed a petition in the U.S. Circuit Court for the District of Kansas to protect that cemetery. Her petition was denied, and she took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court ultimately ruled in favor of the lower courts. But finally, in 1913, Congress repealed the bill that would have allowed the sale of the cemetery. She died on May 28, 1946, and was buried in that cemetery that she fought so hard to protect. Her work in the early 20th century led to the passage of the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, also known as NAGPRA, which is a law that is in effect today and very much used. So Laura Cornelius Kellogg, she is Oneida like me. She was born on the Oneida Reservation in Green Bay, Wisconsin in 1880. She studied at Barnard, Cornell, NYU, Stanford, and the University of Wisconsin, but she never actually got a degree from any of these places. She just really liked school. So she traveled around and took all these different classes at all of these different institutions, never attained a degree though. She was fluent in Oneida, Mohawk, and English, and she became a founding member for the Society of American Indians. She became a voice for the Oneida and the Six Nations, also known as the Haudenosaunee, and spoke on sovereignty and land and treaty rights, specifically those here in New York. In 1914, she and her husband moved to Washington, D.C. to lobby full-time for the rights of Native Americans. Not only did she do work for the Oneida, but she also became involved with the Blackfeet, Brotherton, Stockbridge, Munsee, Osage, and Huron. In 1919, she appeared before the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, calling for justice for the American Indian. She was instrumental in 1922 land claims case placed by the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin in New York. The case was lost, but what it did is it brought up issues of land for tribes that were forced out of New York. There were a lot of tribes here that were forced out. A lot of tribes who have tried to make cases and claims for land back here in New York. So she helped to bring these issues to the forefront. Some of these cases still continue on today. She worked tirelessly for sovereignty and land rights until her death in 1947. Mary Golda Ross, also another one of my favorites. She was born in Oklahoma in Indian Territory and was the great-granddaughter of Cherokee Chief John Ross. John Ross was the Cherokee chief who led his people from Cherokee Territory to Oklahoma on what was called the Trail of Tears. She earned a BA in mathematics in 1928 at age 20, and later in 1938, she earned a master's degree in astronomy from Colorado State Teachers College. She taught math and science in rural Oklahoma for 9 years during the Great Depression. At age 28, she took a civil service exam to work for the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and she was assigned to advise the girls at the Santa Fe Indian School. In 1941, she moved to California to look for work after the US joined World War II. In 1942, she was hired as a mathematician and worked on preliminary designs for space travel, and orbiting satellites. After the war, she went to UCLA and earned a professional certificate in engineering. She became the first female Native American engineer. And in 1952, she started work on preliminary designs for interplanetary space travel. She worked on the Agena rocket project and on preliminary design concepts for flyby missions to Venus and to Mars. When she retired, she worked with Native American youth and encouraged a love of science and math among Native female youth. When she was 96 years old, wearing traditional Cherokee dress, she participated in the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian, and upon her death in 2008, she left a $400,000 endowment to that museum. She is pretty cool. I absolutely love her. I think this woman is my favorite because I've actually had the opportunity and honor to sit with her, talk with her, interview with her, and learn from her. So Ayda Deer. She was born on the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin in 1935. Her mother was a strong advocate for Native rights, and Ayda followed in her footsteps. Ayda's mother was not Native. Ayda's mother grew up in kind of an elite family out here. And she became a nurse, and her family was like, "What are you doing?" And so after she became a nurse, she actually went to work on different Native reservations. And so one of the reservations she ended up working on was the Menominee Reservation. She met Ayda's father. They got married. Ayda was born. She was the first member of the Menominee Nation to graduate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And in 1961, she was the first Native American to receive a master's in social work from Columbia University. She worked tirelessly to end termination and helped have the Menominee Restoration restored. She was instrumental in the 1972 Menominee Restoration Act. So, in order to understand the significance of that, I need to take you back just a few decades to the 1950s, where the US introduced a policy called termination. And what termination did is it terminated your status as a federally recognized tribe. What it did is it kind of moved you into mainstream society, and it got rid of treaty obligations, grant contracts, tribal status, all of that. It got rid of all of that. The first tribe to be terminated was the Menominee tribe. And the Menominee tribe at that time was probably one of the wealthiest tribes in the country because they had a very good and sustainable lumber business. Their reservation is just filled with the most beautiful trees, and it's very thick, and they practice sustainable forestry. So they were very, very good at it. And they also had just won a lawsuit against the federal government for mismanagement of that forest on the side of the federal government. So I can only imagine that the federal government was not happy that they lost a lawsuit, and so termination was introduced. The tribes that were terminated first were tribes that were located on the most resource-rich land. And again, I just told you the Menominee Reservation is rich in timber, very much so. It's very beautiful. And so they were terminated. Well, this threw everything into a spiral. And not only were they terminated, but they had to pay for their termination. So going from one of the most resource wealthy tribes to one of the poorest overnight, super fast. Unemployment went up. People lost services to healthcare. People, were thrown into lower poverty levels. It was bad. And we could talk more about that, but I could spend hours on that. Ayda was in the process of actually going to law school when this happened, because she figured that would be the best way to help her people. But what she ended up doing is she put law school on hold, and she went back to the reservation, and she was boots on the ground activism, right? Trying to get this taken care of. So in 1972, what they did is they had the Menominee Restoration Act passed. And so that overturned termination for the Menominee tribe. Termination itself was overturned in 1975, but the Menominee were the first. And so they actually have their own act. And it's actually celebrated, the day that the act was signed, it's actually a celebrated holiday in the Menominee Reservation, December 22nd, Restoration Day. And she was instrumental in that. So she also then became the first woman to head the Menominee Restoration Committee, which was their new form of government after being reinstated, after being unterminated. They were there, they had to write their own constitution, they had to come up with their committees, they had to deal with enrollment, and she headed that. And up until then, the Menominee were never headed by a woman. They were a patriarchal tribe. So she was the first to do that. She was the first to lead the Menominee people ever as a female. In 1992, she was the first Native American to run for Congress from Wisconsin. She lost that race, but in 1993, she became the first woman ever to be appointed as Assistant Secretary of the Interior as head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So she didn't get to go to Congress, but she still got to make huge changes in Indian country, which is amazing. I recommend her book, Making a Difference. Think of it. She talks about all the work she did when she was head of the BIA, and it is amazing work. In 2000, the year 2000, she headed up the American Studies program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and that became the Indigenous Studies program. She is also now she's retired, but she is a professor emeritus at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's still very active. She's well into her 80s now, but she makes me tired when I'm with her because she's just go, go, go. So I love it. I learned so much from her when I'm with her. Wilma Mankiller, other than having an amazing name, she was born on the Cherokee Reservation in Oklahoma. She's the sixth of 11 children. When she was 11 years old, the family left the ancestral lands and moved to California. And it was in California that she first became an activist, becoming involved in San Francisco's Indian Center. In 1963, she married, and the marriage was difficult. Then in 1969, the occupation of Alcatraz would change her life. She wanted to get involved, but her husband wanted her to remain a traditional wife. She said that when Alcatraz happened, she knew what she was meant to do. Indians had rights, and she was going to let the world know about it. So in 1977, after a divorce, she moved back to Oklahoma. She embraced the Cherokee vision of being of good mind, and she helped organize an effort in the community of Bell, Oklahoma. The community was run down, it was poor, there was no running water, and the population there predominantly just spoke Cherokee. Not much English was spoken at all. She managed to have an 18-mile-long water system put in place and have the dangerous housing conditions repaired. In 1985, she became the first woman principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, an office that she held until 1995. Her administration oversaw the revival of the tribal schools on the reservation and the population increase and transformed nation-to-nation interactions. Sorry, one of my dogs is freaking out. She focused on healthcare and building health clinics and put in an ambulance system and job training for her people, including retail stores, restaurants, bingo operations. She also worked tirelessly to combat misappropriations of Native culture. In 1998, she was awarded the Medal of Freedom. Unfortunately, in 2010, she died of pancreatic cancer. She is such an amazing force of nature. And actually this summer, she is going to be appearing on the quarter. I think her quarter comes out in July. So that's really cool that there's going to be not just a woman, but an Indigenous woman on some US currency. So next we have Eloise Cobell. She was known as Yellow Bird Woman. She was born in 1945 on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. She grew up on her parents' cattle ranch, and like many homes on the reservation, they did not have running water or electricity. She attended Great Falls Business College and Montana State University, but had to leave to help take care of her mother, who was dying of cancer. After living in Seattle and marrying, she and her husband moved back to the Blackfeet Reservation to help her father with the ranch, and there she became the treasurer for the tribe. She founded the Blackfeet National Bank, which was the first national bank located on a reservation and owned by a Native tribe. And in 1997, she won a MacArthur Genius Grant for her work with the bank and the Native financial literacy. While she was treasurer for the tribe, she started to notice discrepancies in the management of funds being held in trust by the federal government for individual Native Americans. The funds were derived from fees that the government had collected for Indian trust land that was leased for lumber, oil production, grazing, gas, and minerals. So if you had these resources on your land, the government was like leasing them from you and then paying you in order to let these other companies come in and extract those resources. But Eloise noticed there was something missing, that the money wasn't adding up. The government was supposed to pay the royalties to the Native owners of the land. Over some time, the accounts became a bit more complicated because original land trusts were divided among descendants. It got very complicated. Eloise had discovered that the owners of the land were not being paid the amounts they were actually owed. She started to work diligently to make sure that the owners of the land were paid what they should be. And in 1996, she filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of all of those who were not being paid or who hadn't been paid in years. And that court case is Cobell versus Salazar. A settlement was finally reached in 2009 under the Obama administration, and Congress passed an appropriation bill of $3.4 billion, which is only a fraction of what was actually owed. The lands were restored back to tribal reservation status, and they also provided a $60 million scholarship fund for students. She died on October 16th, 2011 of cancer, just before the first set of what would become Cobell checks were to be sent out. That was the back payment for people who had not been being paid. And I'll tell you about a documentary that you can watch where you can learn more about her and that case in just a moment. I want to finish up with someone who I've never met, but I want to meet her. I love her from a distance, Winona LaDuke. This is being recorded, so if she sees this, I love you, and I would love to meet you. I admire your work. She was born in Los Angeles in 1959 and is a citizen of the White Earth Ojibwe Nation from Minnesota. She attended Harvard, where she received an undergraduate degree in rural economic development in 1982 and also became involved in Native activism while she was there. She moved to the White Earth Reservation after she graduated and worked as a principal at a local school. Later, she earned a master's degree in community economic development. While working on the White Earth Nation, she became an activist, and in 1985, she helped found the Indigenous Women's Network and worked with women of all red nations to help bring issues to light, such as the forced sterilization of Indigenous women. She also became involved in land recovery for Native nations and founded the White Earth Land Recovery Project in 1989 with the goal of buying back land that was illegally taken. In 1993, she helped found Honor the Earth, which is an organization that focuses on Native environmental issues and the stopping of pipelines. In 1996 and in 2000, she ran as the vice presidential nominee for the Green Party, headed by Ralph Nader. In 2016, she became involved in the protests at Standing Rock over the Dakota Access Pipeline. She also recently started, in the past decade or so, she started a hemp growing farm on the White Earth Reservation that is dedicated to growing hemp from all around the world, along with vegetables and tobacco. Hemp could be a proven moneymaker for tribes because there's so many different uses for it. And you can actually, if you go to, it's online, if you go to Winona's Hemp Farm, there are products available that you can buy because hemp, you can really use it for a lot of different things. So I think that's really cool, and that's a really great use of resources. Now, I did not include her in this PowerPoint, but I do think it's worth mentioning. Sharice Davids from Kansas, who is Ho-Chunk, was one of the first Native women elected to Congress. The year she was elected, Deb Haaland from New Mexico, who is Laguna Pueblo, was also elected. And Deb was also the first Native woman to sit in the speaker's chair to oversee debate in the House. That was such a cool feeling. When I watched that happen, that was so cool. Like it was like I was being represented in Congress. Finally, the government looked like me. And with the implementation of the new administration, Deb Haaland is now the first female Native to lead the Department of the Interior, which oversees land, wildlife, all of the great things in this country, along with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So that is a huge, huge thing for Indian country. I wanted to leave you with this proverb. A nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground. Then it's finished, no matter how brave its warriors or how strong their weapons. And I think this just goes to show how important Native women are in the communities. I always like to leave people with some things to read or watch. An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States is a great book. I recommend that you get it. It should be on your bookshelves. Lakota Woman, and that is by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Lakota Woman is by Mary Crodog, and that accounts her time at the occupation of Wounded Knee. She was very involved in the American Indian movement, and Lakota Woman talks about her journey to being involved in that movement and the work that she did while she was there. Awake, A Dream from Standing Rock is a documentary that you can find, last I checked, you could find it on Netflix. And it shows several different stories about from those who were at Standing Rock and the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, what was going on, what was happening from their perspective. So from the water protectors. And then, and Standing Rock, if you didn't know, the protest started because of one grandmother. It was a woman, a grandmother, an elder. Women have always been at the forefront of our causes. And then 100 Years is a documentary. I believe you can get on Netflix, you can get on Amazon. I think I've seen it on those two places. And that covers the story of Eloise Cobell and that big court case. It talks about the mismanagement of the funds on the side of the federal government and how she fought to get those funds back into the hands of Indigenous people, rightfully so. So amazing documentary. I've watched it several times. It's really good. I recommend it. So I really want to thank you guys so much for taking part of your evening with me to learn about some really awesome Indigenous women. And thank you to the Columbia Land Conservancy and to Heidi. And that's all that I have. So if there are any questions, I'm ready for Q&A. And thank you guys so much for joining and being part of this evening.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was so interesting. So yeah, if folks have questions, you feel free to come off mute and ask them or put them in the chat and I will convey them over to Heather. And while folks are thinking, I did have a question in when you were speaking about Sacagawea.
Mm-hmm.
And did you say that she took her 6-month-old on the expedition? Is that's what, okay, that's what I thought.
Yep,
Yeah.
She strapped that baby to her back and out they went.
Yes, maybe I didn't realize it was so young, but
yeah, it was she had given birth, and then just a few months after she gave birth, that's when they set out.
Amazing.
Yeah, I know. It's like super crazy, super intense.
All right. Yes, Paulina.
Hi, Heather. Good afternoon. I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to give us this presentation, and I thought it was really well done. So I'm from California, based out in Covina on Tongva and Kichlan. And for me, as kind of a young professional in the field of sustainability and climate resiliency, I'm always looking for different ways where I can be an ally and how I can encourage further peers and networks and colleagues of mine to be an ally to Indigenous peoples and their movements and so forth. And I wanted to hear from you a little bit more about, how might we, continue to support and uplift Indigenous communities, not specifically in California, but maybe across the country as well, and what you might, explain or provide or highlight.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for tuning in from California. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the question. I think, one thing that non-native individuals or anyone really can do is, number one, educating yourself about whose land you're on. I think that is super important. And then not just acknowledging that, but then putting action behind it. How do you make things right? How do you do that? But I think, in terms of, land acknowledgements, but then also education yourself, learning about the land, learning about the people, learning about the cultures, asking questions, really getting in on what is going on in Indian country. What are the problems that people are facing? There are a lot of great Indigenous news sources that you can do that. Indian Country Today is a good one. Native News Online is a good one. Following Indigenous people on social media, I think, is always a good one. We're always sharing stuff. I share tons of stuff on my Instagram, and understanding, that if you are not a Native person, but you want to be a good ally or accomplice, pushing the Native voice forward, being there, show up at, the protests or marches or whatever, be there. Yes, be there in body, but also making sure while you're there, you're pushing those voices forward. You're there as the support to help and make sure that those voices shine. I think that's probably one of the most powerful things that somebody can do, is make sure that that Native voice is being heard. Your voice, super important, but making sure that that Native voice is being heard can make all of the difference in the world. I did also put my contact information in the chat again, if anyone wanted to get a hold of that.
Yeah, and excuse me, as I mentioned, we will share out the link to this recording, as well as the resources that Heather has shared. So if you didn't write them down, it's no worries. We'll get them to you.
Okay.
Yeah, other questions? I know it was a lot of really interesting information.
Well, thank you guys so much for, sharing a little bit of your evening with me, learning about some amazing Indigenous women for Women's History Month. Yeah, check out those books and resources and see what else you can find. And, again, contact me if you have any questions. I really appreciate being able to do this.
Yeah, lots of appreciation in the chat.
Awesome.
There goes my dog.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. Please enjoy the rest of your Thursday, your St. Patrick's Day, and have a good weekend.
Yes, thank you. All right. Take care, everyone.